Clara Bensley stood trembling in her wedding gown, tears streaming down her face as the Duke of Wycliffe turned his back on her. His cold voice cut through the silence of their wedding chamber like a blade. "I have no use for sentiment, madam. You will learn that soon enough." But when those tears continued to fall, something ancient and long buried stirred in Alexander's chest, something he had sworn never to feel again. He didn't know that his new bride carried a secret, a letter hidden in her trousseau that would either destroy them both or forge an unbreakable bond. He didn't know that the woman he married out of convenience would become the only person capable of shattering the ice around his heart. The question was, could love grow in the frozen wasteland of a marriage built on duty, or would the revelation of Clara's past betrothal to his greatest rival extinguish the fragile flame before it could truly burn? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of Clara Bensley's wedding dawned cold and grey over London, matching the pallor of her face as her maid laced her into the ivory silk gown that felt more like a shroud than a celebration. She had not chosen this marriage. Her father, a country squire whose gambling debts had mounted to catastrophic proportions, had arranged the union with Duke Alexander Wycliffe in exchange for the erasure of £20,000 worth of obligations. Clara had met her future husband only twice before this day, and both encounters had left her chilled to the marrow. The Duke was handsome in a severe, classical way, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes the color of winter storms, and a mouth that seemed incapable of smiling. He had examined her during their first meeting as one might examine a horse at Tattersall's, noting her acceptable features, her adequate dowry of connections if not money, and her unblemished reputation with all the warmth of a man purchasing furniture. The ceremony took place at St. George's in Hanover Square, a fashionable venue that only emphasized how utterly out of her depth Clara felt among the glittering assembly of aristocrats who had come to witness the Duke's unexpected nuptials. Alexander Wycliffe had been London's most eligible bachelor for nearly a decade, not because of any charm or warmth, but because of his vast estates, his impeccable lineage stretching back to the Conquest, and his considerable fortune. He was 32 years old and had, according to gossip, never been in love. Some whispered that he was incapable of the emotion, that something in his past had frozen his heart beyond all thawing. Clara knew nothing of this past as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, seeing only the intimidating figure of her future husband waiting at the altar, his expression as readable as carved granite. The Duke spoke his vows in a voice devoid of feeling, a mere recitation of required words. When it came time for Clara to repeat her own promises, her voice shook so badly that several guests leaned forward to hear her. Alexander noticed this trembling with a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps irritation, perhaps contempt, before his features settled back into their customary coldness. He placed the ring on her finger with mechanical precision, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, his kiss was so brief and perfunctory that it barely qualified as a brush of lips. Clara felt the tears building behind her eyes even then, but she blinked them back furiously, determined not to shame herself before all of London society. The wedding breakfast at Wycliffe House, the Duke's magnificent London residence, was an ordeal that Clara endured in a fog of misery. She sat at the head of the table beside her new husband, who spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, and spent most of the meal in conversation with a marquis on his other side about matters of parliament and land reform. Clara picked at her food, unable to swallow past the lump in her throat, while around her the cream of society ate and drank and gossiped. She caught snatches of conversation, remarks about how surprising it was that the Duke had finally married, speculation about what had induced him to choose an undistinguished country miss, thinly veiled comments about her father's financial troubles. Each word was a small cut, and by the time the guests finally departed in the late afternoon, Clara felt flayed raw. Alexander dismissed her with instructions to rest before dinner, informing her that they would not be departing on any wedding journey. "I have business in London that cannot be postponed," he said flatly, as though she had asked, which she had not. "You may amuse yourself as you see fit, provided you conduct yourself with the propriety expected of a duchess." Then he withdrew to his study, leaving Clara standing alone in the vast entrance hall of her new home, feeling more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. A housekeeper, Mrs. Fairweather, appeared to show Clara to her chambers. The woman was kind in a brisk, efficient way, pointing out features of the rooms that had been prepared for the new Duchess with obvious pride in the household she managed. The suite was magnificent, decorated in shades of blue and silver, with windows overlooking the rear gardens. But Clara barely saw any of it. She thanked Mrs. Fairweather in a whisper and requested that she be left alone until it was time to dress for dinner. The housekeeper withdrew with a look of sympathy that nearly broke Clara's composure entirely. Alone at last, Clara sank onto the edge of the enormous bed and finally allowed the tears to come. They fell in hot streams down her cheeks as she wept for the life she had left behind, for the girlhood dreams of a love match that would never be realized, for the terrifying future that stretched before her as wife to a man who clearly felt nothing for her beyond obligation. She had known the marriage would be one of convenience, but she had not anticipated how utterly cold her husband would be, how thoroughly he would ignore her existence, except when duty demanded otherwise. She cried until her head ached and her eyes were swollen, and then she cried some more, muffling her sobs in a pillow so that no servant would hear and report her weakness to the Duke. Eventually, Clara forced herself to stop. She rang for her maid, a sweet girl named Anne who had come with her from her father's house, and allowed herself to be bathed and dressed for dinner in a gown of pale green silk that had been part of her hastily assembled trousseau. Anne tried to repair the damage to Clara's face with cool cloths and powder, but there was no disguising her reddened eyes. "You look lovely, Your Grace," Anne said loyally, but Clara could see the lie in the mirror. She looked like what she was, a girl who had been crying, about to face a husband who would undoubtedly find her emotional display distasteful. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have accommodated 50 people, but tonight held only 2, seated at opposite ends of an absurdly long table. Alexander was already present when Clara entered, and she saw his eyes narrow as he took in her obvious distress. He said nothing, however, merely standing briefly in acknowledgement of her arrival before resuming his seat. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silver on china and the soft footsteps of servants. Clara forced down a few bites of each course, painfully aware of her husband's gaze on her at intervals, studying her with that same assessing look he had worn when they first met. She wondered what conclusions he was drawing, and decided she did not want to know. When the meal finally ended, Alexander did something unexpected. Instead of dismissing her or withdrawing to his study as she had anticipated, he said, "Join me in the drawing room, madam. We should speak." Clara's heart sank, but she nodded mutely and followed him to a beautifully appointed room where a fire burned in the grate. He poured himself a brandy and offered her a glass of wine, which she accepted with trembling hands. They sat in chairs facing each other, and for a long moment Alexander simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I do not expect affection from this union," he began abruptly, and Clara flinched at the bluntness of it. "Ours is a practical arrangement, beneficial to both parties. Your family's debts are cleared. You have the protection of my name and position, and I have secured an appropriate duchess to manage my households and eventually provide an heir. These are the terms we must live by." He paused, taking a sip of his brandy. "However, I do expect you to conduct yourself with dignity. This display of emotion is unseemly. I trust it will not be repeated." Clara's hands tightened on her wineglass until her knuckles turned white. Something in his cold dismissal of her pain, coming at the end of this longest and most miserable day of her life, snapped the tight control she had been maintaining. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she said, her voice low but shaking with suppressed feeling, "but I am not a piece of furniture you have purchased. I am a human being with feelings, and I have just been married to a stranger, taken from my home and everything familiar, and told that I must not expect even the most basic kindness from my own husband. If that causes me distress, I cannot simply command it away because you find it inconvenient." Alexander's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had clearly not expected any response, let alone this quiet rebellion. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been respect or perhaps merely irritation, before his features hardened again. "You will learn, madam, that sentimentality serves no useful purpose. I had thought you understood the nature of this arrangement. I understood that it was a marriage of convenience," Clara replied, and now her tears were starting again despite her best efforts. "I did not understand that it would mean living with someone who treats me as though I were an inconvenient obligation rather than his wife. I did not understand that you would be quite so cold." The last word came out as barely a whisper, and she dashed angrily at her tears with one hand. Alexander stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. Clara thought he was dismissing her without another word, but then he spoke, his voice still cold but with an undercurrent of something else, something almost like weariness. "You are correct that you do not know me, madam, nor do you know the reasons I am as I am. It is not my intention to cause you unnecessary distress, but neither can I offer you false hope of a warmth I do not possess. I suggest you adjust your expectations accordingly and find contentment in the considerable advantages this marriage provides. Now, if you will excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to." He left the room without looking at her again, and Clara sat alone by the fire, her wine untouched, tears still sliding down her cheeks. She had known this would be difficult, but she had not anticipated this particular form of misery, this loneliness in the midst of luxury, this coldness from the one person who should have been her partner in life. She wondered how she would bear it, this marriage to a man of ice, and found no answer in the flickering flames before her. That night, Clara lay awake in her magnificent bed, staring at the canopy above her and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Wycliffe House settling around her. She knew that somewhere in this vast mansion, her husband slept in his own chambers, for he had made no move to claim his marital rights, and she was grateful for that mercy at least. But the knowledge that he was near yet utterly distant was its own particular form of torture. She thought of her mother, long dead, and wished desperately for the comfort of maternal advice. She thought of her younger sister, married happily to a clergyman and living in Dorset, and envied her from the depths of her soul. Eventually, exhausted by emotion, Clara fell into a troubled sleep, filled with dreams of endless corridors and doors that would not open. The days that followed established a pattern that Clara soon realized would define her new life. Alexander rose early and breakfasted alone in his study, while attending to business. She took her breakfast in her sitting room and spent her mornings learning the workings of the household from Mrs. Fairweather, who was clearly delighted to have a mistress who showed genuine interest in domestic arrangements. The Duke's previous households had been managed entirely by staff, with no lady's touch, and Clara found satisfaction in the work of organizing, planning menus, and overseeing the small army of servants required to maintain Wycliffe House. It gave her purpose and distraction from her unhappiness. She rarely saw Alexander during the day. He was frequently at his clubs, at Parliament, or attending to business on his various estates through meetings with stewards and agents. When they did encounter each other in passing, he was unfailingly polite but utterly impersonal, treating her with the cool courtesy he might show a respected acquaintance. They dined together most evenings, those interminable meals at opposite ends of the long table, making sporadic conversation about neutral topics, the weather, minor household matters, upcoming social obligations. Alexander never asked about her day or her feelings, and Clara stopped volunteering information when it became clear he had no real interest. 3 weeks into their marriage, they attended their first ball as a married couple. Clara had been dreading it, knowing she would be on display as the Duke's surprising choice of bride, subject to scrutiny and gossip. She dressed with particular care in a gown of deep rose silk that Anne assured her was very becoming, and she wore the Wycliffe diamonds, a magnificent parure that Alexander had sent to her room with a note saying only that she should wear them to establish her position. The weight of the jewels at her throat and ears felt like a collar and chains, beautiful but binding. Alexander came to collect her, and when he saw her, he stopped in the doorway of her chamber. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Clara felt color rise in her cheeks under his intense scrutiny. "You look well," he said finally, which was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever paid her. "The diamonds suit you." Then he offered his arm and led her down to the waiting carriage without another word, but Clara found herself treasuring those few words of approval like precious gems themselves. The ball was every bit as difficult as she had feared. She was introduced to what felt like hundreds of people, all examining her with barely concealed curiosity, all comparing her to whatever idea they had formed of what the Duke of Wycliffe's bride should be. The women were particularly critical, their eyes assessing her gown, her jewels, her figure, her manners with the merciless precision of those who have nothing better to do than judge others. The men were more kind, but that came with its own discomfort, as some of them clearly found the Duke's shy young wife an object of pity or potential prey. Clara navigated it all with desperate determination not to shame her husband, smiling until her face hurt and making polite conversation until her voice was hoarse. Alexander danced the first dance with her as required, and Clara was intensely aware of his hand at her waist, the closest physical contact they had shared since their wedding day. He moved with practiced grace, guiding her through the steps effortlessly, but his expression remained detached, as though his mind was elsewhere entirely. When the dance ended, he delivered her to a group of respectable matrons and disappeared in the direction of the card room. Clara did not see him again until it was time to leave, though she was painfully aware of his absence, of dancing with other men while her husband clearly had no interest in her company. On the carriage ride home, Clara gathered her courage to speak. "Did I do well tonight? Your Grace, I hope I did not embarrass you." She hated the tentative note in her voice, the way she sounded like a child seeking approval, but she genuinely wanted to know if she had fulfilled her duties adequately. Alexander looked at her in the dim light of the carriage lamps. "You conducted yourself appropriately," he said, which was not quite the reassurance she had hoped for, but was perhaps the best she could expect. Then surprisingly he added, "Lady Pemberton remarked that you were a credit to my house. She is a woman whose opinion carries weight, so you may consider the evening a success." It was, by Alexander's standards, high praise, and Clara felt a small, warm glow of satisfaction that she had managed to meet his expectations in at least this one thing. But that warmth faded quickly in the following days as the pattern of their distant, cold marriage resumed. Clara threw herself into her duties as Duchess, calling on the appropriate ladies, hosting small gatherings that were noted for their elegance and good taste, and managing the household with increasing confidence. She also began to explore London, sometimes accompanied by Anne, visiting museums and galleries, finding solace in art and beauty even as her home life remained barren of both. She wrote long letters to her sister, carefully edited to remove any hint of unhappiness, describing the wonders of London society without mentioning the emptiness of her marriage. She read voraciously, haunting the Duke's extensive library and finding escape in novels and poetry, though she was careful to be gone before Alexander might use the room himself. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into their marriage, Clara was in the library when Alexander unexpectedly entered. She started to rise and excuse herself, but he waved her back to her seat. "You need not leave on my account," he said, moving to his desk. "I merely need to retrieve some documents." He gathered what he needed, but then paused, looking at the book in her hands. "What are you reading?" The question surprised Clara so much that she hesitated before answering. It was perhaps the first personal question he had ever asked her. "Byron," she said, showing him the volume. "I find his poetry quite moving, though I know some consider him scandalous." She waited for Alexander to dismiss her taste or make some cutting remark, but instead, he looked thoughtful. He had a gift for language, certainly, Alexander said, though his personal life was indeed reprehensible. Still, one can appreciate the art while condemning the artist's behavior. He seemed about to say more, then caught himself and moved toward the door. But he paused there and spoke without turning. "You may use the library whenever you wish. I would not have you feel you must hide in your own home." It was a small thing, but Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this tiny gesture of consideration. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed. He nodded and left, and Clara sat holding her book of Byron's poems, wondering if perhaps there was some small hope that her husband might eventually see her as something more than an obligation to be managed. That evening at dinner, Clara dared to initiate conversation beyond the usual banalities. "I received a letter from my sister today," she said. "She writes that her eldest son has begun his studies at the village school and is showing great aptitude for mathematics. She wonders if he might eventually be suited for university." Alexander looked up from his plate with actual interest in his eyes. "How old is the boy?" "7, Your Grace. But Mary says he can already work sums that boys 3 years his senior struggle with." "Then he should certainly be encouraged," Alexander said, and something in his voice was warmer than Clara had heard before. "A mind for mathematics is a valuable gift. If he continues to show promise, I would be willing to assist with his education when the time comes. It would be appropriate for me to support the son of my wife's sister, particularly if he has genuine ability." Clara's heart swelled with gratitude that took her completely by surprise. "That is extraordinarily generous, Your Grace. Mary and her husband are good people, but a clergyman's income would never stretch to the fees for a good school. let alone university. Such an opportunity would change my nephew's entire life. Then it is settled, Alexander said, and for the first time since their marriage, something that might have been a smile briefly softened his stern features. Have your sister send me reports of the boy's progress. If he maintains his promise, we shall see him properly educated. He returned to his meal, and the conversation lapsed back into silence, but Clara felt as though something had shifted slightly, some tiny crack appearing in the wall of ice that surrounded her husband's heart. Over the following weeks, Clara noticed other small changes. Alexander began asking her opinion on minor household matters, actually listening to her responses and sometimes acting on her suggestions. He mentioned in passing that he had heard compliments about a dinner party she had hosted, acknowledging her success in a way that warmed her despite its casual delivery. Once, when she mentioned she had never seen a particular play that was being performed at Drury Lane, he arranged for them to attend, sitting beside her in his box, and even explaining some of the more obscure references in the dialogue. These were tiny gestures, barely qualifying as kindness by most standards, but to Clara, starved as she was for any sign that her husband saw her as a person rather than a duty, they felt like treasures. Clara found herself watching Alexander when he was unaware, trying to understand the man she had married. She noticed that he never spoke of his family beyond the most basic facts, that he had no close friends, that he held himself rigidly apart from genuine human connection with everyone. Not just her. She learned from Mrs. Fairweather, in carefully casual conversation, that the Duke's parents had died when he was 17, that he had an older brother who had inherited the title first, but who had passed away just 2 years later, leaving Alexander unexpectedly elevated to the dukedom at 19. He changed after that, Mrs. Fairweather said quietly, became hard, distant. The young man I had known as a boy seemed to disappear overnight. Whatever warmth he possessed went with his brother to the grave. This information helped Clara understand a little of what had formed her husband's cold nature, but it also saddened her profoundly. She found herself wanting to reach the man behind the ice, to find some way to bring warmth back into his frozen heart. But she had no idea how to begin such a thawing when he held her so firmly at a distance. 2 months into their marriage, Clara received an unexpected visitor. She was in the morning room working on correspondence when the butler announced Lord Ashford, and Clara's blood ran cold. Richard Ashford had been a neighbour of her father's, a viscount with a modest estate bordering their own land. He had also, during the previous summer, been Clara's secret suitor, courting her with all the ardour of a romantic hero from one of her novels. They had walked together, talked together, shared poetry and dreams and kisses stolen in her father's garden. Clara had believed herself deeply in love with Richard, and he had sworn he felt the same. He had promised to speak to her father about marriage as soon as he had settled some business affairs that had required his attention. But then her father's gambling debts had come to light, spiraling out of control with terrifying speed, and Richard had suddenly stopped calling. Clara had written to him, desperate for his support during her family's crisis, but he had never replied. When her father had announced the arrangement with Duke Wycliffe, Clara had been heartbroken, but had consoled herself that at least she would never have to face Richard again, never have to know with certainty that his love had not been strong enough to withstand the scandal of her family's financial ruin. And now here he was, standing in her morning room, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression that held guilt and regret, and something else she could not quite identify. "Lord Ashford," Clara said coldly, remaining seated and not offering her hand. "I confess I am surprised to see you. I was not aware you were acquainted with my husband." "I am not, particularly," Richard said, and his voice held the same caressing tones that had once made Clara's heart race but now left her unmoved. "I called in hopes of seeing you, Your Grace. I have thought of you so often since you left the country. I had to know if you were well." "As you can see, I am perfectly well," Clara said, keeping her voice carefully neutral though her heart was pounding. "I am married to one of the most powerful men in England. I want for nothing material, and I am learning to find satisfaction in my new role. There was no need for your concern." Richard stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "Are you happy, Clara? Truly happy? Because I have heard things about Wycliffe. They say he is cold as stone, that he has no heart, that he married you purely for convenience without a thought to your feelings or well-being. If that is true, if you are suffering, I want you to know that I made a terrible mistake." Clara's hands clenched in her lap, but she kept her expression serene. "I am a married woman, Lord Ashford, and whatever mistakes you made or did not make are no longer relevant. I must ask you to leave. It would not be appropriate for you to call again." But Richard, emboldened by desperation or folly, pressed forward. "I was a coward, Clara. When your father's debts became known, I panicked. I let my family convince me that the connection would be disastrous, that I could not tie myself to such scandal. But I was wrong. I should have fought for you. I should have offered for you myself, regardless of the financial difficulties. I loved you, Clara. I still love you. And if there is any chance, any possibility that you might feel the same, that we might, too—" "Enough." Clara stood abruptly, her face pale but her voice steady. "You speak of love, but you know nothing of it. Love does not abandon someone when circumstances become difficult. Love does not ignore desperate letters begging for support. Love does not wait until that person is safely married to someone else before declaring itself. What you feel is guilt, Lord Ashford, or perhaps merely wounded pride that I am now a duchess while you are merely a viscount. But it is not love, and even if it were, I am the Duchess of Wycliffe now, and I will not dishonor my vows or my husband's name by entertaining this conversation another moment. Please leave, and do not return." Richard looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in Clara's expression must have convinced him she was serious. He bowed stiffly and departed, and Clara sank back into her chair, shaking. She felt as though a door to her past had opened and then slammed shut again, leaving her confused about her own feelings. A year ago, even a month ago, she would have thought that seeing Richard again would break her heart anew. But instead, she found herself thinking only of Alexander, of what he would think if he knew about this visit, of whether he would believe her when she said she had sent Richard away, of how it would wound the fragile progress they had made if he thought she had encouraged this contact. The thought of hurting Alexander, of losing the small measures of warmth he had begun to show her, frightened Clara far more than the memory of her past love for Richard Ashford. And that realization told her something important, something she had not consciously acknowledged until this moment. Somewhere in the past 2 months of cold civility and tiny kindnesses, of learning to manage his household and read the minute changes in his expression, of treasuring every scrap of approval or attention he offered, Clara had begun to develop feelings for her husband. They were fragile, nascent feelings, more hope than love, but they were real, and they made her vulnerable in a way she had not been before. Clara sat in her morning room for a long time after Richard left, trying to sort through her emotions. She decided that she would not mention the visit to Alexander. Richard had been sent away definitively. There was no reason he would call again, and telling her husband about it would only create awkwardness and potential suspicion where none need exist. It was a small deception, really just an omission, and Clara convinced herself it was the right choice to protect the delicate understanding that was slowly developing between herself and the Duke. But that evening, as she prepared for dinner, Clara found herself watching her reflection in the mirror and wondering if she was making a mistake. She valued honesty, had always prided herself on her integrity, and keeping secrets from Alexander felt wrong even as she told herself it was for the best. In the end, she decided to hold to her original resolution. She would not mention Richard's visit unless directly asked, and she would ensure that if he tried to call again, he would be turned away before ever gaining admittance. It was the practical solution, the one that would cause the least trouble, even if it sat uneasily on her conscience. The season progressed into November, and London grew cold and often foggy. Clara found herself enjoying the rhythm of her days despite the underlying loneliness of her marriage. She had made a few friends among the other young married ladies of the ton, women who seemed to genuinely like her for herself rather than merely cultivating her for her position. She corresponded regularly with her sister, whose letters were full of warmth and family news that made Clara homesick, even as she smiled over the antics of her young nephews and niece. And she continued to spend time with Alexander in their limited but increasingly comfortable interactions, learning to read the subtle cues that indicated his moods and occasionally even making him smile with a well-timed observation or comment. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room after dinner, a rare occurrence where they spent time together without the need for conversation, Clara working on embroidery while Alexander read, she looked up to find him watching her. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" she asked, setting down her needlework. Alexander hesitated, seeming to consider his words carefully. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "that perhaps we should remove to Wycliffe Park for the winter. London grows dreary this time of year, and I have estate business that would be better conducted from the country. If you have no objection, I thought we might leave next week." 10 times alive. Clara's heart leaped at the thought of leaving the city, of seeing the Duke's principal country seat, which was by all accounts magnificent. But more than that, she was moved by the fact that he had asked her opinion rather than simply informing her of his decision. "I would like that very much," she said warmly. "I confess I miss the country. London is wonderful, but I grew up surrounded by fields and trees, and I find I long for that sometimes." Something that might have been approval flickered in Alexander's eyes. "Then it is settled. We shall remove to Wycliffe Park next Thursday. You may wish to consult with Mrs. Fairweather about what household items should accompany us, and which staff will make the journey. The park maintains its own full complement of servants, but I know some ladies prefer to have their personal maids and such with them." They spent the next hour in something approaching actual conversation, discussing the journey and what Clara might expect from the estate. Alexander even told her a little about the history of Wycliffe Park, how it had been in his family for generations, how it encompassed nearly 10,000 acres of prime Hertfordshire land, how the house itself had been built by the second Duke in the late 17th century and had been added to by subsequent generations. He spoke with more animation than Clara had heard from him before, and she realized that he loved his estate in a way he seemed incapable of loving people. It saddened her, but it also gave her hope that somewhere beneath his icy exterior, genuine feeling still existed. The journey to Wycliffe Park took a full day, with the ducal travelling coach making the journey in relative comfort, though the November weather was cold and damp. Clara found herself growing increasingly nervous as they travelled, wondering what the estate would be like, whether the staff there would accept her as readily as those in London had, whether this change of scene might somehow improve her relationship with Alexander, or whether the isolation of the country would only emphasize the distance between them. As evening approached and the coach finally turned through massive stone gates topped with the Wycliffe coat of arms, Clara got her first glimpse of her new home. Wycliffe Park was magnificent, a sprawling Palladian mansion of pale stone that glowed in the fading light. It sat in the midst of a landscaped park that even in late autumn showed evidence of careful planning and maintenance. Trees in their winter bareness lined the long drive, and in the distance, Clara could see a lake reflecting the sky. The house itself was enormous, far larger than the London residence, with a classical facade featuring columns and pediments that spoke of wealth and power accumulated over centuries. "It is beautiful," Clara breathed, and she felt rather than saw Alexander turn to look at her. "It is home," he said simply, and there was something in his voice, a warmth, a belonging, that Clara had never heard before. Whatever coldness defined the Duke of Wycliffe in London seemed to thaw slightly in the presence of his ancestral estate, and Clara felt a flutter of hope that perhaps here, in this place he clearly loved, she might finally begin to reach the man beneath the ice. The staff assembled in the entrance hall to greet their Duke and his new Duchess, and Clara found herself facing another round of scrutiny from new servants. But the housekeeper at Wycliffe Park, a Mrs. Thornton, was a motherly woman who immediately took Clara under her wing, showing her through the vast house with obvious pride in every room and feature. The ducal apartments were in the east wing, and Clara's rooms were, as in London, separate from but adjacent to Alexander's. They were beautiful, decorated in greens and creams, with windows overlooking the park, and furnished with a mixture of antiques and more modern pieces that somehow blended perfectly. That night, Clara dined with Alexander in a more intimate dining room than the cavernous one in London, and she was surprised to find him more relaxed than she had seen him before. He spoke freely about the estate, pointing out that she could see some of his favorite riding paths from the windows, mentioning that the library here was even more extensive than the London one, asking if she rode and if so, what sort of horse would suit her. It was the longest genuine conversation they had ever had, and Clara found herself responding with matching ease, speaking of her childhood in the country, her moderate skill with horses, her love of walking in all weather. "I shall have a suitable mount selected for you," Alexander said. "The stable master here has excellent judgment, and if you wish to explore the grounds, you need only inform someone of your route, so that if you are delayed, Search parties will know where to look. The estate is extensive, and it would be easy to become lost, particularly in winter when darkness falls so early. Clara thanked him and dared to add, "Perhaps you might accompany me on some rides. I would enjoy learning about the estate from you, and I confess I would feel more confident with a guide at first." She held her breath, expecting him to make some excuse. But instead, Alexander nodded. "I ride most mornings," he said. "If you can be ready at 9 tomorrow, I will show you some of the estate. We shall keep to an easy pace until I can assess your skill. But yes, I think that would be acceptable." It was the closest he had come to suggesting he might enjoy spending time with her, and Clara went to bed that night with a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire burning in her chamber grate. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Clara dressed in her riding habit with care, wanting to look capable and appropriate for the excursion. The habit was a deep blue that Anne assured her brought out the color of her eyes, and as Clara pulled on her riding gloves, she found herself hoping that Alexander might notice and approve. It was a small vanity, but she allowed herself the indulgence of wanting to please her husband, even in such a minor way. Alexander was waiting for her at the stables, already mounted on a magnificent black stallion that suited him perfectly, all power and barely contained energy. He watched as a groom helped Clara mount the pretty chestnut mare that had been selected for her, and she was grateful for her years of riding at home as she settled easily into the side saddle and gathered her reins with practiced competence. She saw approval in Alexander's eyes as he observed her seat and handling of the mare. "This is Rosalind," Alexander said, gesturing to Clara's mount. "She has an excellent temperament and will serve you well. She knows the estate thoroughly, so even if you ride alone, she will find her way home if needed." Then he turned his stallion and set off at a walk, and Clara followed, her heart lighter than it had been in months. They rode through the park, Alexander pointing out various features and landmarks, speaking of the history of different areas with an enthusiasm Clara had never seen in him before. He showed her the home farm where the estate grew much of its own food, the tenant cottages that housed the workers who maintained the vast grounds, the ornamental gardens that would be spectacular in spring and summer, but now lay dormant under a light frost. He took her to the edge of the lake and told her that in summer it was possible to take boats out on the water, and that there was a small island in the center, where a folly had been built by his great-grandfather. He spoke of his childhood here, rare glimpses into a past he never discussed, mentioning climbing certain trees, exploring forbidden areas, getting into mischief with his brother. "You must have been happy here as a boy," Clara ventured, and immediately worried she had overstepped when Alexander's expression closed slightly. But after a moment, he nodded. "I was happy here," he said quietly, "before everything changed. This place holds my best memories, which is perhaps why I do not come here as often as I should. It reminds me of what I lost." He said nothing more, spurring his horse forward into a gentle canter that precluded further conversation. But Clara felt she had been given a precious gift, a tiny window into understanding her husband's frozen heart. They rode together most mornings after that, and Clara found herself looking forward to these excursions with an eagerness that surprised her. Alexander was different outdoors, more relaxed, more willing to speak freely. He taught her the best paths for various weather conditions, the spots where deer were often seen, the locations of the boundary markers that defined his vast property. He complimented her improving skill with horses and even laughed, an actual warm laugh, when her mare shied at a startled pheasant and Clara kept her seat through sheer determination. The sound of his laughter was a revelation to Clara, transforming his stern face into something approaching handsomeness, and she found herself thinking about it long after they had returned to the house. In the afternoons, Clara explored the house itself, which was so large it would take weeks to see every room. The library was indeed magnificent, 2 stories tall with galleries reached by spiral stairs, housing what must have been thousands of volumes. She spent hours there, selecting books and reading in the comfortable chairs near the fire, occasionally encountering Alexander when he came to retrieve something for his own reading. They began to share book recommendations, a tentative connection over literature that gave them something neutral to discuss. Clara discovered that her husband had surprisingly broad taste in reading, everything from philosophy to poetry to agricultural treatises, and she enjoyed hearing his thoughts on various authors and works. The evenings at Wycliffe Park were quieter than those in London, with no social obligations or entertaining to occupy them. Instead, Clara and Alexander fell into a comfortable pattern of dining together and then retiring to the drawing room, where they would occupy themselves with reading or, occasionally, chess. Alexander had taught Clara the game, patient with her early mistakes, and she discovered she had some aptitude for it. Their chess matches became a highlight of her days, an opportunity to engage with her husband in a way that felt almost intimate, leaning over the board to study the pieces, occasionally meeting his eyes when a particularly good or terrible move was made, sharing small moments of triumph or defeat. "You are improving rapidly," Alexander commented one evening after Clara had nearly beaten him, only losing because of one careless move in the endgame. "Another few weeks and you may actually defeat me." "I shall take that as a challenge, Your Grace," Clara replied with a smile, emboldened by his good humor. "Though I suspect you are being generous in your assessment, you clearly know strategies I have not yet begun to comprehend." "Perhaps," Alexander said, and there was something warm in his eyes as he looked at her. "But you have good instincts, and you learn from your mistakes. Those are valuable qualities, in chess as in life." It was the sort of compliment that Clara treasured, all the more precious for its rarity, and she went to bed that night feeling genuinely happy for the first time since her wedding day. Christmas approached, and Clara threw herself into preparations for the holiday. She consulted with Mrs. Thornton about traditional celebrations at Wycliffe Park, learning that the Duke had not hosted any significant Christmas festivities in years, typically spending the holiday alone or in London attending to business. But Clara wanted to change that, to bring warmth and celebration to this house that Alexander loved but seemed afraid to fully embrace. She arranged for greenery to be brought in to decorate the public rooms, for special foods to be prepared, for gifts to be distributed to all the staff and the tenant families on the estate. When Alexander discovered what she was planning, she feared he would object, but instead, he merely looked at her thoughtfully. "You wish to make Christmas here?" he asked, and Clara nodded. "I know you are not accustomed to celebrating, Your Grace, but I grew up with Christmas as a time of warmth and family and joy. I hoped that perhaps we might begin some traditions of our own. Nothing excessive, just making the day special, if you would permit it." She held her breath, waiting for him to dismiss her plans as sentimental foolishness. But Alexander surprised her. "Do as you wish," he said slowly. "It has been many years since Wycliffe Park saw a proper Christmas. Perhaps it is time that changed." Then, to her utter astonishment, he added, "My mother loved Christmas. She would decorate every room, fill the house with music and laughter. After she died, it seemed wrong to continue those traditions, as though doing so would somehow diminish her memory. But perhaps I was mistaken. Perhaps the better way to honor her memory would be to bring that joy back to this house. If you wish to undertake it, I will not stand in your way." It was the most personal thing Alexander had ever shared with her, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the trust implicit in allowing her to revive traditions his mother had established. "I shall do my very best to honor her memory, Your Grace," Clara said softly. "Thank you for allowing me to try." Oh, Christmas Eve arrived, and Wycliffe Park was transformed. Clara had worked tirelessly with the staff, and every public room glowed with candles and evergreen boughs, filling the air with the scent of pine and beeswax. The great hall, rarely used, had been opened and prepared for a feast that would include not just Clara and Alexander, but also the senior staff and several of the tenant families. It was an old tradition, Mrs. Thornton had told her, one that the Duke's mother had maintained, but that had been abandoned after her death. Clara had decided to revive it, hoping it would please Alexander and help forge connections between the Duke and those who worked his land. When Alexander saw the transformed house, he stopped in the entrance hall and simply looked around in silence. Clara, who had been supervising some last-minute arrangements, approached him nervously. Is it acceptable, Your Grace? I know it is quite different from how things usually are, but I thought—" She trailed off as Alexander turned to look at her, and she was shocked to see moisture in his eyes. "It is exactly as I remember it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Exactly as my mother would have done it. You have, Clara. You have given me back something I thought lost forever. I do not know how to thank you." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a thrill through her that she barely understood. "You need not thank me," Clara said quietly. "I only wanted to bring some joy to your home, to our home." She dared to add the last words, and Alexander nodded slowly. "Our home," he repeated, as though testing the words. Then, to Clara's astonishment, he reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently before releasing it. "Come, let us prepare for our guests. This Christmas, it seems, will be one to remember." The feast that evening was a success beyond Clara's hopes. The hall was filled with warmth and laughter, as tenants and staff enjoyed excellent food and drink, and Alexander presided over it all with a graciousness that surprised those who knew him only as the cold, distant Duke. He spoke with his tenants about their farms and families, inquired after the health of elderly workers, praised the efforts of those who maintained his estate. Clara watched him in wonder, seeing a side of her husband she had never glimpsed before, and realized that somewhere beneath his icy exterior lived a good man who had simply forgotten how to let that goodness show. After the feast, when the guests had departed to their homes, Clara and Alexander were left alone in the drawing room. The house seemed to hum with residual warmth and life, and Clara felt more content than she could remember feeling in years. Alexander poured them each a glass of wine, and they sat by the fire in comfortable silence for a long while before he spoke. "I owe you an apology, Clara," he said abruptly, and her head came up in surprise. "I have been distant since our marriage, cold. You have done nothing to deserve such treatment, and yet I have offered you little beyond basic courtesy. Tonight, seeing this house alive again, seeing you bring warmth to these halls that have been cold for far too long, I realize how unjust I have been. You are a good woman, and you deserve better than what I have given you." Clara's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "You have not been unkind, Your Grace, merely reserved. I understand that our marriage was one of convenience, that you did not choose it out of affection. I have not expected more than you could give." "But perhaps you should have," Alexander said, looking at her intently. "Perhaps we both deserve more than a cold arrangement of mutual convenience. These past weeks here at Wycliffe, I have found myself enjoying your company, looking forward to our morning rides, our chess games, our conversations. You have awakened something in me that I thought long dead, Clara, and while that frightens me, I find I am grateful for it." Clara felt as though she could not breathe. This was more than she had dared hope for, this acknowledgement that their relationship had grown into something beyond mere duty. "I too have found happiness in these past weeks," she admitted. "I treasure every moment we spend together, every conversation, every small kindness you show me. I do not ask for more than you can give, Alexander, but I will gratefully accept whatever you are willing to offer." It was the first time she had used his Christian name, and she saw his eyes widen slightly at the intimacy of it. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and Clara felt the air between them charged with possibility. Then Alexander rose and crossed to where she sat, extending his hand. When she took it, he drew her gently to her feet, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "May I give you your Christmas gift?" he asked quietly, and Clara nodded, unable to speak. Alexander reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed an exquisite ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, clearly antique and valuable. "This was my mother's," he said softly, "one of her favorite pieces. I would like you to have it, not as the Duchess of Wycliffe, but as Clara, as the woman who has brought light back into my life and home." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, as Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger next to her wedding band. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "I shall treasure it always, not for its value, but for what it represents." "And what is that?" Alexander asked, his voice barely audible. "Hope," Clara said simply. "Hope that we might build something real together, something warm and good from the cold foundation we began with. Hope that you might someday care for me as I have come to care for you." Alexander's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "I think I am already beginning to care for you, Clara," he said. "More than I thought possible, more than I ever intended. You have melted something in me that I believed frozen beyond all thawing. I do not know what the future holds, but I would like to try, truly try, to make this marriage more than a convenience. If you are willing." "I am willing," Clara breathed. And then Alexander was kissing her, not the cold, perfunctory kiss of their wedding day, but a real kiss, warm and tender and full of promise. Clara's arms went around his neck, and she responded with all the pent-up longing and hope and affection she had been harboring. And for a long, perfect moment, there was nothing in the world but the two of them and the future they might build together. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he said softly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Merry Christmas, Alexander," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This moment of connection and possibility was worth all the weeks of loneliness and cold civility. This was the beginning of something real, and Clara was ready to embrace it with all her heart. The days after Christmas passed in a glow of newfound intimacy. Alexander and Clara spent increasing amounts of time together, not out of duty but from genuine desire for each other's company. They rode together every morning, sometimes racing across the fields with laughter trailing behind them, sometimes walking their horses slowly while deep in conversation about everything and nothing. They read together in the library, sharing favorite passages and debating the merits of different authors. They played chess in the evenings, and Alexander taught Clara to play the pianoforte in the music room, standing behind her to guide her fingers over the keys in a way that made her blush and her heart race. Most importantly, they talked. Alexander began, slowly and haltingly, to share pieces of his past that he had never spoken of before. He told Clara about his brother, Edward, who had been everything Alexander was not, warm and open and beloved by all who knew him. He described how Edward's death in a riding accident had devastated their father, who had died himself less than a year later, of what everyone said was a broken heart. He spoke of being thrust into the dukedom at 19, unprepared and overwhelmed, of building walls around his heart to survive the crushing weight of responsibility and grief. "I told myself that feelings were a weakness I could not afford," Alexander said one evening as they sat together on a sofa in the drawing room, closer than they ever had before. "That caring too deeply only led to pain. So I taught myself not to care, not to feel, to be the cold, efficient duke that everyone expected. And it worked. For years it worked, until you came into my life and began, gently, inexorably, breaking down those walls I had built so carefully." Clara took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I'm glad I could reach you," she said softly. "The man beneath that ice is worth knowing, Alexander. He is kind and thoughtful and capable of great warmth. I am honored that you trust me enough to let me see him." They had not yet shared a bed, but the intimacy between them was growing daily, expressed in touches and glances and kisses that left Clara breathless and longing for more. She could feel Alexander's struggle, his desire warring with whatever held him back from taking that final step toward a fully consummated marriage. She did not push, understanding instinctively that he needed to come to it in his own time, when he felt truly ready to open himself to such vulnerability. It was early January when everything changed. Clara had ridden out alone one afternoon, wanting to explore a section of the estate she had not yet seen, while Alexander was occupied with his steward going over accounts. She had told Mrs. Thornton her intended route and set out on Rosalind, enjoying the crisp winter air and the freedom of solitary riding. She had been gone perhaps 2 hours, well within the bounds of propriety, when she returned to find Wycliffe Park in an uproar. Alexander met her at the stables, his face white with fury such as she had never seen. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I have had half the estate out searching for you." Clara dismounted in confusion, handing Rosalind's reins to a groom. "I told Mrs. Thornton where I was going," she said. "I was never in any danger. What has happened? Why are you so angry?" "Come with me," Alexander said through gritted teeth, taking her arm and marching her into the house with such force that Clara had to nearly run to keep up. He dragged her into his study and slammed the door behind them, rounding on her with eyes blazing. "I received a very interesting letter today," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "from Lord Richard Ashford. Perhaps you remember him?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Richard? How could she have forgotten about Richard? It had been 2 months since his visit to London, and she had pushed the incident from her mind so completely that she had never thought to mention it to Alexander. Now, seeing the letter in her husband's shaking hand, she realized her mistake with sickening clarity. "Alexander, I can explain," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Can you?" he demanded. "Can you explain why my wife's former lover writes to me claiming that you and he had an understanding before your marriage? Can you explain why he suggests that you only married me out of desperation when he, tragically, was unable to offer for you himself. Can you explain why he expresses concern for your happiness and implies that he would be willing to what? To renew your connection? To offer you escape from your marriage? He is lying, Clara said desperately, moving toward Alexander only to have him step back, away from her. Or at least, he is twisting the truth. Yes, Richard and I had an understanding last summer. He courted me, and I believed I loved him. But when my father's debts became known, Richard disappeared. He never offered for me, never even replied to my letters. I had not seen him or spoken to him until he called at the London house in September, and I sent him away, Alexander. I swear to you, I sent him away and told him I would not dishonor my vows or your name by entertaining his attentions. And yet you never mentioned this visit to me, Alexander said coldly. You never thought it important to inform me that your former suitor had called, that he had declared himself still in love with you? Why, Clara? Why keep such a thing secret, unless you had something to hide? Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but she forged ahead, desperate to make him understand. I did not tell you because I was afraid. Afraid that you would think I had encouraged him, that you would doubt my commitment to our marriage. We were just beginning to find some comfort with each other, and I did not want to jeopardize that with an incident that meant nothing. I handled it poorly. I see that now. But please believe me when I say that I have been faithful to you in thought and deed. Richard means nothing to me. You are my husband and I. She stopped, realizing she had been about to say she loved him, but the words died on her lips at the expression of contempt on his face. I do not believe you, Alexander said flatly, and each word was like a knife to Clara's heart. I was a fool to think you were different, to allow myself to feel anything for you. This is why I closed my heart, to avoid precisely this sort of betrayal and pain. You are like every other woman, drawn to title and wealth but harboring feelings for another. The tears, the sweetness, the gentle persuasion, it was all an act to secure your position while keeping your options open should something better present itself. No, Clara sobbed, reaching for him again. No, Alexander, please, I love you. I know I have made mistakes, but please believe me when I say that my feelings for you are real. Everything between us these past weeks has been real. Do not speak to me of love, Alexander snarled, and the ice was back in full force, colder than it had ever been. I know what love looks like, madam, and it is not lying by omission. It is not keeping secrets about former suitors. It is not making a fool of your husband while he, like an idiot, allows himself to feel something for you. No, you have shown me clearly where your true loyalties lie, and they are not with me or this marriage. What are you going to do? Clara whispered, terror gripping her heart. What I should have done from the beginning, Alexander said, his voice as cold as death. Maintain a proper distance between us. You will remain here as my duchess. You will fulfill your duties as required, but I will not allow you to make a fool of me again. The warmth between us is over. We shall return to what we should have always been, polite strangers bound by law but nothing more. Now get out of my sight. Clara fled, running to her rooms where she collapsed on her bed in an agony of weeping. Anne tried to comfort her, but Clara was inconsolable. She had finally found happiness, finally begun to thaw her husband's frozen heart and win his affection, and now it was all destroyed by her own foolish decision to keep Richard's visit secret. She understood Alexander's anger, even his sense of betrayal, but the speed with which he had turned cold again, the ease with which he had dismissed everything between them, showed Clara just how fragile their connection had been. He had been ready, even eager, to believe the worst of her, to assume betrayal rather than trust in her word or her growing feelings for him. For days, Alexander would not see her. He took his meals alone in his study, rode out early before she could join him, and locked himself away from any contact. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the sake of the servants while dying inside. She wrote to Alexander, long letters explaining everything, begging for his forgiveness and a chance to prove her loyalty, but he returned them unopened. She considered leaving, simply departing Wycliffe Park and retreating to her father's house or perhaps to her sister in Dorset, but she knew that would only confirm Alexander's worst suspicions and make any reconciliation impossible. On the 5th day of this torture, Clara could bear it no longer. She waited until evening, then marched to Alexander's study and entered without knocking. He was at his desk, going over estate papers, and he looked up in surprise and anger at her intrusion. "I told you I did not wish to see you," he said coldly. "And I no longer care what you wish," Clara replied, her voice shaking but determined. "You will listen to me, Alexander, because I have something to say, and you will not silence me by locking yourself away like a coward." His eyes flashed dangerously at that, but Clara pressed on before he could speak. "You accuse me of betrayal, of keeping secrets, of harboring feelings for another man. And you are right that I should have told you about Richard's visit. It was wrong of me to keep it from you, and I understand why you feel deceived. But your response, your immediate assumption that everything between us was false, your willingness to throw away what we had built without even giving me a chance to truly explain, that shows me something far more troubling than my mistake. It shows me that you never truly trusted me at all. That despite all the warmth and intimacy we shared, some part of you was always waiting for me to betray you, always expecting the worst because you have convinced yourself that caring for anyone only leads to pain." Alexander had risen from his desk, his face dark with anger, but Clara continued, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, Alexander, but it came from fear of losing the fragile connection we had, not from any desire to betray you. I sent Richard away definitively. I told him I was married and that my vows were sacred to me. I chose you, Alexander, chose our marriage even when it was still cold and lonely, chose to stay and try to reach your heart even when you gave me nothing in return but ice. And when you finally began to thaw, when you finally started to let me in, I fell in love with you. Truly, deeply in love with the man beneath the Duke and the man who loves this estate and chess and his mother's memory. The man who laughed at my clumsy attempts to improve at riding and kissed me on Christmas Eve as though I was precious to him." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I love you, Alexander, and I know you felt something for me too, whether you want to admit it now or not. But if you are so determined to believe the worst, if one mistake is enough to destroy any trust you might have had in me, then perhaps Richard's letter was a blessing in disguise, because it showed me that your heart, while it might have begun to thaw, is not yet ready to truly love. And I deserve to be loved, Alexander. I deserve a husband who will trust me, who will believe in my word and my commitment, who will fight for our marriage when difficulties arise rather than immediately retreating into cold distance. So I leave the choice to you. You can continue to hide behind your walls, convinced that everyone will betray you eventually, or you can take a leap of faith and choose to believe me, choose to trust that what we had was real and worth fighting for. But I will not beg anymore. I will not chase after a man who is determined to see betrayal where there is only love and loyalty." Clara turned and walked toward the door, her heart breaking but her head held high. She had said her piece, laid her feelings bare, and now it was up to Alexander to decide whether his pride was more important than their future together. She was reaching for the door handle when his voice stopped her. "Wait." The word was raw, broken, nothing like his usual cold control. Clara turned slowly to find Alexander standing frozen by his desk, his face a mask of anguish. "Clara, wait, please." She waited, not moving from the door, as Alexander seemed to struggle with himself. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough with emotion. "You are right, about all of it. When I received that letter, some part of me was almost relieved. It confirmed what I had always believed, that allowing myself to care would only lead to pain and betrayal. It was easier to believe you had deceived me than to trust in what we had, because trusting meant being vulnerable, and I have sworn never to be vulnerable again." He moved toward her slowly, like a man walking through deep water. "But these past 5 days without you have been the worst of my life. Worse even than when Edward died, because then I did not know what I was losing. Now I do. I know what it is to laugh with you, to ride beside you in the morning and look forward to our chess games in the evening. I know what it is to kiss you and to feel that perhaps there might be happiness in this world for me after all. And losing that, losing you, even by my own choice, has shown me that the pain of vulnerability is nothing compared to the pain of living without love." He was standing before her now, close enough to touch but not reaching for her. "I was wrong, Clara. Wrong to assume the worst, wrong to shut you out, wrong to value my pride over our marriage. Can you forgive me? Can you, despite everything, still care for a fool who nearly threw away the best thing that has ever happened to him?" Clara looked at him through her tears, seeing the genuine anguish in his eyes. the vulnerability he was finally, truly showing her. "I told you I loved you, Alexander," she said softly. "That did not become untrue simply because you hurt me. Yes, I forgive you, but you must promise me something." "Anything," Alexander said fervently. "Promise me that you will try, truly try, to trust me, to trust in us. That when difficulties arise, as they inevitably will in any marriage, you will talk to me rather than retreating into cold distance. That you will fight for what we have rather than assuming it is doomed to fail. Can you promise me that?" "I can promise to try," Alexander said, and there was such honesty in his voice that Clara felt her heart crack open with love for him. "I cannot promise perfection, cannot promise that I will not sometimes struggle with old habits and fears. But I swear to you, Clara, that I will try with everything in me to be the husband you deserve, to trust you, to open my heart to you fully, to choose vulnerability over safety because you are worth that risk." Clara closed the distance between them and threw her arms around his neck, feeling his arms come around her waist and hold her tightly. They stood like that for a long time, simply holding each other, before Alexander pulled back slightly and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Clara Wycliffe," he said, and the words were like a benediction, a promise, a new beginning. "I have loved you, I think, since Christmas Eve when you gave me back my mother's joy and my own capacity to feel it. I have been falling more deeply in love with you every day since, and the thought of losing you, of destroying what we had through my own stubborn pride, terrifies me more than anything in this world. Please tell me I have not ruined everything beyond repair." "You have not," Clara whispered, her hands coming up to cover his. "You have only made our foundation stronger by proving that we can survive misunderstanding and hurt, that our love is resilient enough to weather storms. Kiss me, Alexander. Kiss me and show me that your heart is truly mine." Alexander did not need to be asked twice. He kissed her with a passion and tenderness that stole her breath, his hands tangling in her hair as hers clutched at his shoulders. It was a kiss that spoke of love and forgiveness and promise, a kiss that sealed their reconciliation and marked the true beginning of their marriage, not as strangers bound by duty but as two people who had chosen each other freely and completely. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against Clara's. "Come to bed with me tonight," he said softly, "not out of obligation, but because I want to be truly your husband in every way, because I want to show you physically what I have finally learned to feel emotionally. If you are willing." Clara looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability and hope in his eyes, feeling her own desire rise to meet his. "I am willing," she said simply. "I have been waiting for you, Alexander, waiting for you to be ready to truly let me in. Take me to bed, husband, and make me fully your wife." The night that followed was a revelation to them both. Alexander was tender and patient, showing Clara pleasures she had never imagined, worshipping her body with reverent touches and whispered words of love. And Clara responded with equal passion, giving herself completely to her husband, holding nothing back, offering him the full depth of her love and trust. It was not merely physical union, but a joining of souls, the final melting of the ice that had surrounded Alexander's heart, replaced now by the warmth of love freely given and joyfully received. Afterwards, as they lay entwined in Alexander's bed, Clara traced patterns on his chest while he played with her unbound hair. "I was so frightened," she admitted. "When you turned cold again, when you would not see me or speak to me, I thought I had lost you forever. I thought the ice had reclaimed you completely." "The ice was always an illusion," Alexander said quietly. "A defense mechanism, nothing more. You showed me that, Clara. You showed me that beneath the cold exterior I had built was a man still capable of feeling, still capable of love. And now that I have allowed myself to feel again, now that I have you, I cannot imagine ever going back to that frozen existence. You have melted my pride, Clara, melted all my careful defenses, and I find I am grateful for it even though it terrifies me still." "We shall be terrified together then," Clara said with a small smile. "Learning to navigate this marriage with open hearts instead of closed ones, making mistakes and forgiving each other, building something real and lasting from the cold foundation we began with. Building something beautiful," Alexander agreed, pulling her closer. Together. The weeks that followed were a honeymoon period, such as neither had anticipated during their actual wedding. Alexander and Clara were inseparable, spending every possible moment together, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal enthusiasm. They rode together every morning, explored the library together in the afternoons, and spent their evenings playing chess or simply talking by the fire, sharing dreams and fears they had never voiced to another soul. Spring came early that year to Wycliffe Park, and with it came news that filled Clara with joy. She was carrying Alexander's child, their heir, conceived during those passionate nights following their reconciliation. When she told him, Alexander's face transformed with such pure happiness that Clara wept to see it. He held her tenderly, one hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, and whispered promises of the love he would give to their child, the warmth he would provide that he himself had lost too young. Richard Ashford's letter was never mentioned again. Alexander burned it without ceremony, and they both agreed that the past was best left buried. What mattered was the future they were building together, brick by brick, moment by moment, with love as their foundation instead of duty. On a warm April morning, as they walked hand in hand through the gardens that were beginning to bloom, Alexander stopped and turned Clara to face him. "Do you remember our wedding day?" he asked. "How cold I was, how thoroughly I broke your heart before our marriage had even truly begun." Clara smiled up at him, her free hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. "I remember," she said, "but I also remember everything that came after, the slow thawing, the gradual warming, the moment you finally let me in completely." "I was a fool," Alexander said, raising her hand to his lips. "A prideful, frozen fool who nearly destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him. But you were patient with me. You melted the ice around my heart with your gentleness, your persistence, your tears that showed me I could still hurt and therefore still feel. You saved me, Clara. We saved each other," Clara corrected softly. "You gave me strength I did not know I possessed. You taught me that real love is worth fighting for, worth taking risks for. We both had to change, to grow, to learn to trust, and we did it together." Alexander pulled her close, kissing her forehead with infinite tenderness. "I love you, Clara Wycliffe. My Duchess, my wife, the mother of my child, the keeper of my heart. I shall spend the rest of my days proving that to you." "And I love you, Alexander," Clara replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "My husband, my love, the man whose heart was made of ice until together we discovered it was really made of something far stronger. It was made of hope and courage, and the capacity for a love deeper than either of us imagined possible." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by new life and new growth, two people who had begun as strangers, bound by obligation, and had become something far more precious. They had traveled through coldness to warmth, through distance to intimacy, through pride to love. The Duke's heart had indeed been made of ice, but Clara's tears and tenderness had melted it completely, revealing the beautiful, vulnerable, loving man beneath. And in doing so, she had found her own heart transformed, discovering strength and passion and a capacity for forgiveness she had never known she possessed. Their story was not a fairy tale with an instant happy ending. It was something better, something real. It was a story of two imperfect people choosing each other every day, working through their flaws and fears, building a love that could weather storms because it was rooted in truth and commitment and mutual respect. The ice had melted, the pride had been humbled, and in their place had grown something infinitely more valuable. They had grown real, lasting, transformative love, and that love would sustain them through all the years to come, a warmth that would never fade, a light that would guide them through whatever darkness the future might hold. As they walked back toward Wycliffe Park together, their child growing between them and their future stretching bright before them, both Alexander and Clara knew they had found what so many seek but few discover. They had found true partnership, genuine intimacy, and a love that had been tested and proven strong. The Duke's heart was no longer made of ice. It was made of love, and it belonged entirely to Clara, as hers belonged to him, now and forever.